Invincible.
Hey, Marcus, how are you?
Having trouble finding the mute button.
Me too, right? It's like so one of those weeks. Good morning, everyone.
Yeah.
Good morning. I see a bunch of people are hopping in and chat here as well. Welcome to another Stone Ridge Confab, where we are just chatting to start here. So, Mr. Marcus, how has your week been? We've had some fun sales and marketing meetings, right?
Yeah, it's been good. Had some people in town, so fellow Stone Ridge people get to see each other face to face instead of on video, which has been a lot of fun. Ran into the office yesterday. It was packed.
Was it really?
Oh my gosh, fighting over conference room space because we needed to do a demo.
Yeah.
So we got it, but yeah, I hadn't seen that many people in a long time.
Well, supposedly every Wednesday at Stone Ridge Software, I think Mr. Goronsky was telling us that that's when all the SMB team comes in as well to the office to say hi. So I'm gonna have to crash the party at some point here, right, and have some fun with that. So
yeah, it was good. It was good to see people.
Awesome. So today's going to be a fun time. We're going to be going through a little bit more in terms of the challenging of the development paradigm, right? In terms of understanding a little bit more of the Power Platform and really what you can do as end users and as developers and as, basically anyone interacting with the Power Platform, right? So it's going to be a fun conversation because, I think a lot of people are a little bit lost in some ways in terms of where they should be doing development, how they should be doing development, and where they should even start having some of those conversations, right? Because
yeah, I think so.
There's just so many different possibilities that we have at this point, and it's actually kind of confusing, I think, from my point even at some point.
Yeah, and I just encourage people to check out the tools. I've been using this tool metaphor the last couple of times I've explained it. We've been living with a flathead screwdriver and a Phillips bit screwdriver, and now we've got all sorts of different options in our tool belt. So I think just up front, it's important to set the stage and really say, Scott and I are not saying this is the be all end all tool, right? This is not the tool to fix every single problem that you're going to have. What this is another tool that we haven't had before, and it's pretty cool. It's pretty cool.
Yeah. Yep. And Sabrina, you're right. What can't you do with the Power Platform, right? There's just so much that you can do. I
wish it could mow my lawn.
Right. Well, maybe we could actually get it to do that with some IoT devices involved with it. But I think the key thing.
Actually, you know what? You probably could, Scott.
Right.
My neighbor's just got one of those.
Did they get one?
Well, he's got the it's not like the vacuum brand. What's the mows your lawn, right?
Yeah.
He's got a little dog house out under his deck, and the thing pops out and mows his lawn. So actually, you know what? I'm wrong. It probably could mow my lawn.
Right? The little iRobots or whatever they were back in the day, right? From that brand name. Yeah. Yep. Oh, that's really cool. Yeah. So, it's just so much is changing, right? And I think from a development perspective, too, I think that when we initially, let's start framing, like, where maybe some of the emotional aspect of it is to start, because that to me is kind of a driver in this conversation. More specifically, I remember back in 2018, 2019, when Microsoft is really starting to focus on this Power Platform concept of these citizen developer based concepts, where
Yep.
initially I'm just like, well, wait a second, what's up with pro dev? Because there was so much of a focus that was on, for example, then the end user developer, the citizen developer in that conversation. And I think
Sounded a
what
little gimmicky
yeah,
almost,
right,
right?
right. Yeah,
Yeah.
I think it's still, for some people it still does. And
Yep.
I'm trying to get to the reality of trying to prove to people that, your reality needs to change a little bit too as you go through this. And I think Matt Van Dyke, I don't know if he's on stream here as well, but Matt's said this a couple times as the practice director at Stone Ridge. Like, you should be getting excited about this type of stuff because it actually helps make it easier to communicate between pro dev and end users to be able to build solutions then that are very impactful inside of the business, but don't take a huge amount of cost or time to be able to do that. And I think,
Yep.
Marcus, like we were talking a little bit earlier before stream, I mean, we had a prospect story, and I thought that this was so cool that you brought up regarding you went to do a demonstration and talk about the Power Platform, and something happened. Do you want to kind of extrapolate on that a little bit?
Yeah. So George, one of our sales execs, he and I were actually on site. I'm going to say 6 or 7 weeks ago with a prospect. So there to talk about Business Central and manufacturing client. So that's what they do. And in the process of that, they're also an ag client. So they grow a product basically and run it through a manufacturing process. And they have uh, Excel spreadsheets. This is an Excel expert, right? He's got a PhD in Excel, and he has collected piles of data about the farms, about how they're growing it, about chemical treatments on the product, what product they actually grow the seeds to. So, I mean, the whole life cycle, pre-growing, product in the ground, through the harvesting process, and
Yeah.
they've got Excel spreadsheets with literally mounds of data in it, and they do some pretty sophisticated analysis on their growing process.
Yep.
So we kind of looked at it and said, well, probably not a great fit to bring that data into the ERP application, right? It's not really ERP-ish. You harvest it, then it is. So we've got a harvested product. We put a lot number on it. We track it through the manufacturing process and sell it. That part we've got, but sort of this ERP stuff, not a great fit. We
So
said, you know what you should do? What?
yeah, and just to understand this really quickly before you get to that, this is an ag company, right? So this is a
Yep.
company, technologically speaking, a lot of ag companies are on very older platforms, right? We know that because we actually resell leverage, right? That's a add-on to the ag market for it.
Yep.
So, okay, so they're coming from way older technology here too. They're Excel gurus, like you said. I'm curious in
Yep.
chat how many of you have used Excel to tackle most of your business process issues. I think it's like the number one ERP solution on the planet is Excel. But
Oh,
go ahead. Sorry, I
yeah.
didn't mean to interrupt.
Yeah, no, and they took it from a paper-based system because quite honestly, when they're in the process of harvesting, they use Word templates to print forms, and then the people in the harvesters have a clipboard that they literally write on, right? And then that clipboard with a paper system comes in, and then they key that data into an Excel spreadsheet. Okay, so a lot of important data. They're doing some pretty sophisticated analysis again with it. So just sort of in passing, we said, you should really look at the Power Platform as a solution for this, where you could develop an app to collect that data, and then you've got a place to store that data, and then you could use Power BI to report against it. And by the way, that also connects to Business Central. So you've got a unified reporting platform in which to analyze all the different data sources, the data inputs to do what you need to do with it.
Yep.
Okay, so we did our final discovery on the Business Central side. We came back home, did their demo last week. So just sort of in passing, before we kicked it off, said, well, did you get a chance to look at the Power Platform? And the gentleman there, the IT guy, he's like, well, look at it. Sure, I signed up for a user, and he said, I actually built an app. I said, what? He said, yeah, we built the app. We took the data structures that we had in Excel. We put them into the Dataverse. So we created tables in the Dataverse. We already know what we need the front end to do and what it to look like. So we created an app. And he said, so by the way, the person that's harvesting can sit in the truck and they just push a button when the harvesting starts. He's got it connected to do GPS tracking, so they know what farm they're in, they know what row they're on. They've got a start and end tracking on the row. They must have a scale in the truck. I wasn't sure about that, but it picks up automatically via IoT to know what weight they just harvested.
Yeah, some scale interface of some sorts. Yep.
Yeah. So I'm not sure exactly what it is. And he said, "Oh, these are rural farms, so we also do it in offline mode." I'm like, what? So literally in a couple weeks, the guy built the app that they need to make this work. And then we talk about Business Central, and okay, so now they have a lot number that's got all of their pre-ERP data collected, tracked inside of Dataverse. Again, the interface is a Powerapp to get to it, and then we can feed that in as a receiving transaction into Business Central. George and I were blown away. We're like, we keep saying this is easy, and there's a living example that this is absolutely doable for people.
Exactly.
And again, they did the pre-work of design.
And that's an important distinction too, because I think that the part here that people need to understand isn't that the tool is going to solve the problems. It is that the tool helps reduce the amount of time and budget requirement to be able to make changes and then deploy those and manage those. But you're still going to want to go through an analysis life cycle at the beginning.
Yes.
You're still going to want to create a functional requirements document that states what is the inputs and outputs of this particular code or process that you're creating.
Absolutely.
Right? I mean, so really what we're saying is take the other areas and plug them in, so that way you can basically then use the Power Platform to be able to tackle some of those requirements that you have. And also from if we back up a little bit more too and think about it, so the other thing that comes up time and time again is that it really is expensive. And I'm just going to put it out there, and maybe in chat, tell me I'm wrong. I'd love to hear your opinion on this. But it is so expensive to develop inside of ERP apps. It just, they're bigger, they're more complex. The table structures are definitely going to be generally more encompassing in terms of what they're trying to tackle from product functionalities perspective. But a lot of customers and a lot of prospects, even when we get into conversations with them, they don't need something that's going to boil the ocean immediately. They need something that's incremental value to be able to tackle a business process with it that they can build off of and continue to improve, because they feel that that's a differentiator inside of their business. So I think that's
it
where
doesn't
it gets...
negate the need for the ERP system either.
Exactly, right?
This process that we're looking, or the prospect that we're talking to, they still need a purchase order. They still need receiving. They still need inventory, right? They're still going to do sophisticated lot tracking and lot traceability through the ERP system. So it doesn't negate any of that either.
Yeah, and Rob, the doers, right? I mean, it is about doing, right? I mean, there's a lot of planning that goes into it. And I know from a team perspective too, like at Stone Ridge, I mean, there's a balancing struggle that we even have with it in terms of making sure that what we recommend from a technical solution lines up then to what project managers need for time and BAs need for time. But really what we're trying to do with the platform longer term is that we still have that as a business, and we're going to continue to provide that value. But we want end users now to start entering into this perspective, because from a company's perspective, I know there's a lot of companies out there that get frustrated with partners. It's how we came to being, because partners are too expensive, or they don't react fast enough, or there's just some standard culturally that you may have inside of your organization that may not align then towards a partner organization, for example, and what they're trying to do from a business perspective. I guess it always comes down to this in my mind. You've got strong partners, and you try to find the best partner you can interact with as a company, right? That, hands down, that's what we should be doing in life. But at the same point, if you want to control something directly, you control it inside of your organization, right? You control it like for manufacturing in the United States. Look at what happened with supply chain issues with that. If we had more manufacturing inside of the United States, maybe we would have had less issues. I can't, we don't know the answer entirely with it, but what we're trying to say here is that that control aspect, it gives you something that you really didn't have before, because the cost or barrier to entry to be able to understand, for example, how to write code inside of Nav or Business Central as it is now. I mean, that there's not a million resources out there that are doing that, right? So this kind of levels that from that perspective.
Yep. And there still is a place for in the ERP development. So I just want to make sure that's clear too.
Yeah.
This is not a one-for-one replacement of development inside that ERP system. There's absolutely use cases that you would say, no, that is not a Power Platform solution. That is an ERP, inside the ERP solution. So again, it's tool options that we have.
So maybe we should start the conversation then to challenge the development paradigm. Let's start at the very base level with this. So if we're going to build an app, Marcus, I always view that there's 3 different levels of conversation that we need to have. And each of those levels we could assign a role or resource to for that conversation as well. But we start with data, right, to understand where it is located and how we're going to interact with it. We have an integration, so it goes data, integration, and with the integration then that's going to be the data movement, right? The data movement layer of what are we doing with this data, so to speak, from a transport. It's almost like an integration / transport layer. And then the last layer I always look at is the presentation layer to the end user, how the end user interacts with that data and whether or not we're updating or saving data as we go through this process. And the Power Platform is designed really to encompass all those, right?
Yep, absolutely.
So with that, I'm going to go ahead and just share my screen here. Let's go ahead and flip over. I've got the 2 speakers too. Got my wonderful Windows 11. Look at that. Isn't that a cool start menu?
I don't know how I feel about that.
I am struggling. Hey, I will tell you this. Right-click on taskbar settings. I can't get my task manager. I have to actually type in task manager to get to my task manager now. Microsoft, please listen to your users, ungrouping, all these taskbar settings. I do like this because I never use like the widgets that they have, so to speak, right? Which is that thing that used to be embedded inside of the start menu, right? So, I don't know. They're making progress, right? Progress, hopefully, in a positive way. All right, so let's go here and take a quick look at this. So first things first, let's pretend we are going to develop some type of an application. So let's look at it from an end user perspective where we're not going through and doing a whole development methodology revolving around it, right? Because really what we want to do here is we want to challenge it and say, well, where would you need to get some pro dev potentially involved in a process for a conversation, right? So where can we get away with as an end user up to the point where we would then use pro dev by using a partner or using a true developer to be able to address a business need. And one of the
there's a line there.
Right,
there's
right.
a line there.
And I think that's where we want to have that challenging aspect inside of our conversation, because really that's really where, as an end user, you start getting into trouble if you start doing things that, you shouldn't do. So let's go, for example, let's go to powerapps.com. So I'm going to go ahead and load up Powerapps. We're going to go ahead and sign in inside of here. Now, within Powerapps, remember, we have an environment that we interact with, right? So in my environments, I'm typically in my CE, finance, and operations environment because they're linked together and I interact with it. Now, one of the things that's an important concept from an end user perspective, when you start looking at where do you put your data, Dataverse is a very solid place to put your data. Like if you want to talk about where do I store rows of data that have columns that have different values that I need to then interact with, we can pretty much guarantee now, guys, that in the future here, that Dataverse is going to be used for all of our systems in some way, shape, or form. We know for a fact. Yep, go ahead.
And it is for the CRM, sales. I don't know what we're going to call those today. Apps, right? So we're talking about customer service. We're talking about professional service, field service, right? All of those are actually apps sitting in the Dataverse using Powerapps.
Exactly. So
Yep.
very first, so just even the first conversation here. So let's say that you have Business Central right now and you don't have the Power Platform. Get your environment or get a Dataverse environment up and running so that you have that. And you can experiment with the trial first. We don't jump into production immediately with this obviously, but you can start doing this by having this environment that's there. Now, there's a couple of different ways then that you can get data then into really Dataverse as part of your process. One of them is if you go like, for example, to Business Central, if I remember correctly, Marcus, and you'll have to guide me a little bit through this. In Business Central, there's a CDS connector that you can enable that will basically then start copying the data then from Business Central into Dataverse as part of its process, right? So,
Yeah, and there's two options here. We should at least clarify this. One option is actually moving data. So that would be when you go into Business Central and you enable the customer engagement configuration. So that's moving data like items, accounts, customers, contacts, that sort of thing. Actually moving data between the two of them. The other option is the virtual table option.
yep,
So
yep,
within the Dataverse, you can create or enable a virtual table. It's a copy, right? It's a copy or a view into the Business Central database to view that data. So I think on the last confab we kind of looked through those. So and we've talked through how to set those up too.
yeah,
So I
exactly.
don't know that we need to necessarily.
Yeah, it's a
Well,
good point. Yeah.
yeah.
So I'll just reference it here because we'll have to go into it in just a little bit. The other
I can
one though
open
too
up
is
there.
like dual right? That's another one. So in finance and operations apps, you typically use dual right then to actually integrate between both Dataverse and then the finance and operations app. So on other confabs, like you said, Marcus, we went through and did that. You should check out what's going on with our tenant right now in the background if you can see what's happening there.
Um,
So
I think the other thing to point out there is there's a Business Central methodology to connect to the Dataverse, and then you've got your F&O methodology to connect. And so, like the dual write is not functionality that you can apply to your Business Central environment
yeah,
at
and
this
one
point.
one thing, and,
So
and, and yeah, I think it's a very valid point. Here's what I come to as well with it. Just something to consider. Don't overthink it too, right? So if you need data to be inside of Dataverse to be able to build an app so you can have a customer list or a vendor list as an example, you can use inside of Dataverse here. So one option would be to go through this entire dual write methodology and get it enabled, and then using this to actually copy the data, or using the native BC one that's inside of here as well. But inside of Dataverse, there is a concept called data flows that you can use. And
yes,
this is important to understand because now we're
so a
talking.
fourth option.
Exactly, right? Right? We're
Yeah.
talking dynamics data when we're talking about like dual write and then the integration with CDS or Dataverse for Business Central and the setup that's related to it. But let's say you've got other data sources that you want to pull in, and you want that data because in your application you want to look up that data or you want to reference that data. So virtual entities and then dual write don't apply in those scenarios, right? So instead what you can use is you can use data flows to take data out of an existing system and then bring it into Dataverse for you to interact with. And I'm talking about it from an end user perspective because what I want to do is I want to be empowered to create an app to address a specific need that I have inside of my department, for example. And at the end of the day, maybe I have to have a formal creation of a ERP based document. An example, like if I was going to build a requisition application, well, I could create that requisition app inside of Dataverse, but then I have to eventually have it generate a purchase order, right? Or
Yep.
go into a purchase order for approval before it goes to its next step with it. And instead of actually designing all of this inside of finance and operations, well, you could do it inside of Dataverse then to do that. You could come in here, go to your data flow, and in finance and operations, as you can imagine, I'll show the development environment just really quickly here. I mean, Marcus, have fun with this, right? I mean, code, classes, macros, you name it. Like, this is some deep stuff. This isn't stuff that an end user is typically going to interact with. So from
Right.
an end user interaction to get data into my Dataverse, I can go into Dataverse, I can go into my data flows, I can say I want to create a new data flow and start from blank. I want to call this my vendors, and we're going to say from FinOps is what we'll do for this one. And I can click on the create action for it. And what's really cool about this is that Power Query is used then to be able to grab a lot of this data that we can interact with then to basically take and then pull in from all these different types of data sources. And these data sources may be databases that you have locally on-prem, or they also might be something that is in the cloud as well. And you can see that there's a bunch of different online services that we can connect to as well to be able to get to that. Now, most systems have a concept called OData, right, inside of them that allows you basically to query the environment to be able to interact with it. And I want to do some caveats from an end user perspective here first on this as well. A lot of times when you talk to a developer and they say, for example, that you should never hit the database directly, there's truth to that, but it's really dependent on what you're doing with it. So an example of that, if you're running reports that are based off of OData and they're querying Business Central or even finance and operations apps or even Dataverse for that matter, what you're doing is you're making a very, very slow way to take data, bring it into a report, and then render it. Because OData isn't designed to be very fast when it comes to its interaction. What OData is designed to do is make it easier from an application design perspective to trigger business logic and to interact with small sets of data to be able to actually go back and forth and interact with it. Now, the exception to that is where if you can use OData, for example, to grab a batch or a large amount of records and then bring it into another system, and then you're not repeating those OData calls then back into the environment, you're now not impacting, for example, the BC, or in this example, the finance and operations environment, because we've now copied that data from where it's at inside of finance and operations and then brought it into Dataverse to interact with it. So this is just something to note. And usually when we start thinking through this a little bit more, you got to think about things like, okay, now I've got a copy of data that's inside of Dataverse that I'm interacting with, because now I'm not using dual write or I'm not using virtual entities to reference that data. The point here is that you can get away with it if you're just using it, for example, for lookups and reads and all that type of stuff. It shouldn't matter. A vendor, for example, if you're creating an app and you want to do a requisition system with it, if you're just pulling the vendor records into Dataverse for it, does it really matter if it's a copy, a read-only copy of that data that's inside of Dataverse? Right. You know, right? So you need to have these types of conversations, right, to make sure that you're aligning to the strategy that you have as well. But an example...
Well, the timing of that data movement is a conversation.
Exactly, right? How often does it refresh, right? Is it real time or anything else like that, right?
Yeah. There's a real conversation that needs to happen around real time. Everybody always says they need it in real time.
90% of the time they don't. And that's what we're finding out more and more through a lot of the conversations that we have, right?
Well, and I like the concept of near real time. You know, if you do synchronize every 10 minutes, every half hour, that gets you probably even higher than 90%.
What most people need isn't real time from a master data structure perspective for customers, vendors, products, all that kind of stuff. They need it scheduled to be fairly good, like you were saying, Marcus, near real time. What they typically need more real time with are the transactional, like orders and requisitions.
Yes.
Like we can do that,
you're
though,
shipping something.
right? Exactly, and we can do that with the balance here as well, because what we can do is we can actually create a connection. And what I typically do here, so when we're doing finance and operations, we have to add the data for it. And what's really cool is that it actually respects the company filter as well, so you can say specifically what company you want for a connection. And basically what I'm doing here is I'm saying that this is an organizational account that I'm using to log in to be able to grab this data. And then we're going to see it basically come through here, click on that to be able to get to that data. And we can see now that I have that set up, and I'm going to click next to basically get a list now of all the different entities that I can interact with to be able to take this data and then generate a table inside of Dataverse to store this data so I can use it inside of an application. So this is, I'm starting with 101 here, right? Because this is every customer has, every end user has this dilemma. I want to grab data. We don't have dual write enabled because it's too complex from what we've been told to do it, or we have lots of errors with it, and we haven't been able to focus and figure out what's going on with it. We don't have virtual entities enabled, but we have a BC or a finance and operations environment that's up and running, and I want to grab data from it and do something with it. This is as simplistic as it gets, basically, inside of our Power Platform environment.
Yep. And I think just a terminology thing. You said entity.
Table, right? Yep.
Yeah, that term is table again, right? We've sort of switched back to the table term versus entity term. So for people that
are confused with those, right? Yep, yeah. Absolutely. So an example here then. So this is inside of finance and operations. Of course, we have to make it complex in finance and operations, Marcus. We do call them entities over there too. So there's a difference in ours with it, which is right. So, but that being said, here's where it comes to ProDev. So first ProDev tip here for challenging the development paradigm. If you don't see the data in here that you need to access, like in finance and operations apps, you have to create code to be able to do that. You have to create a solution or an extension inside of finance and operations to be able to get to more data. And this also, if I remember correctly, Marcus, this is the same as well for BC. When you connect to BC, we have an API set, right, that we need to call, and we need that API to be created. It's not a publish action, so to speak. It's actually an API that we typically then interact with that to get to that data, unless we're using OData, right?
Right. So you can use the web service configuration inside of Business Central if you wanted to, or the API option. Our tenant is back up, by the way, Scott.
Is it? Okay, cool.
Yeah, somebody must have done a reboot, so you might have to.
I bet you it's that support case that we've got open right now, right? That's going on.
Yep.
So good to know. So basically, though, inside of here, Marcus was saying, so it's the web services, right, that are going to be inside of here. So these web services inside of Business Central are basically tables and queries that you can expose, and then you've got a link here that you can use to connect to it and basically go through that same thing from a data flow perspective of actually referencing it, copying and pasting it inside of there, and now you've got access then to that data that you can basically interact with as part of that process. So vendors is going to be the one I'm going to pick on here just as an example. We've got our vendors V2 table. I'm just going to go ahead and highlight it as an example inside of here. And then I'm going to go ahead and click on the transform data to actually bring it to the next step inside of its process. So the point here is that we've been able to very easily reference a link of what that data is, sign into the environment because we want to build an application then that we're going to take this data and interact with it. And then from there, we're now in a query editor, the Power Query Editor, that is very similar to what Excel used. So if you've ever used Excel, Power Query, right? Exactly. It was introduced initially with that as part of its concept and design, right?
Yep. Yeah, I'm very happy to see Power Query here. If you've as you said with Excel, if you've played around with it, you've sort of cut your teeth on that. What you've learned there is going to apply here. There's some nuanced differences, but you're certainly building upon a knowledge base. It's not a new product. I guess Power BI is a little different where you can get into DAX code, but again, Power Query is in Power BI as well.
Yeah, right. So if you wanted to now, there's grouping that you can do. You can do different data types that you can define for fields that are inside of here. So I mean, there's a lot that you can do then inside of here to start getting this to a point where you can then interact with the data to be able to bring that information then back into really into Dynamics here. So I'm going to go ahead and.
Scott, can I ask you a question more on that?
Yep.
Would you bring in every column? Do you go through and do a subset of data elements when you go in there? I mean, because if you look to the right of those tables, there's a whole bunch of foreign key references that you really can't get to, do you exclude those then as you're loading data?
Typically, I do a massaging of the data beforehand during that Power Query, where what I'll do is I'll state that these are the fields that I don't want to have in the data set. So there was, like you were saying, Marcus, on the far right, there's compound, what we call compound or complex data types that are references of tables that are inside of those columns, right? So you can almost imagine a table within a table type of a thing. So typically, to your point, like you wouldn't do it all fields and all tables. You would just do it more commonly with some of the key values that you want to have here, because you can imagine it here when I do all those fields. Look at all this. I mean,
Yeah,
there's
it's a
a
lot more work.
ton in here, right, that you have to maintain
Yeah.
and manage, right?
Yeah, that's one thing I've noticed when I did this with a query is the first time I just took the table and brought it in, and it's a rather tedious exercise. I think it's also more difficult just because you got more data that you're looking at as you're interacting with it, and if I even look at Business Central, I think the item table is 147 columns. You're not probably using all of them. So I just made it simpler by not bringing them in.
Yeah, right. I mean that makes a lot of sense to do it in that fashion. So you can see that it's actually going through here, and the reason I'm starting with the data flow in this conversation is because instead of going through and designing a table up front as an end user, you could, in the Power Query that we were looking at, massage those fields and those columns that are in here. So to your point, Marcus, like we could actually go through here and start saying, I don't want to have this particular column, right? So I could actually remove this column. And you can see over here that it's keeping track of all the different actions that I do to get to a point then where I've got a lower subset of information that I'm typically then interacting with. So you would typically then go through this process of just getting maybe the account number, the data area ID, maybe some of the address details would be inside of here, right? Then when you click on the next portion inside of here, those fields aren't going to be a requirement to map basically as you go through your mapping exercise. Now the nice thing about the data flow though is that you can actually have it then create the table in Dataverse for you. So you can actually, as you're going through this process and you do the mapping, you'll see it here on the far left, instead of having to go into tables and create a table from the ground up, you can actually use data flows to generate the table initially and then use it then to dump the data inside of there. So you've just
Yep.
shortcutted a bunch of steps to go through that. It just makes it easier, I guess,
Yeah.
from an end user
Yeah.
perspective.
Creating the table manually is a lot of tedious work.
Yep,
You just don't need to do it.
exactly.
Yep.
Thank you, Sanjin, for the subscribe and follow. Welcome. All right, so let's keep on moving here. So you can see here, load settings, load to a new table. We've got our table name that we define for it as well. On a vendor one, I could make it so that it deletes rows that no longer exist too, so it can actually do a comparison as an example with it. We're not going to do that with a vendor. We typically probably don't want to do that, to be honest, because
Yep.
even if the vendor gets changed, that would be a thing to kind of, you don't want that vendor to disappear on all your old requisitions, for example. You would click next to this, and basically what it's going to do is it's going to then generate a refresh schedule selection that you can do, and you can then do, a frequency-based refresh. So if you want to get to minutes, if you want to refresh every minute, you theoretically could. So that gets to that near real time. With master
Right.
data, though, you should be asking, do you really need to refresh it 20 times a day? Like,
Right.
why not just have it at specific dates and times, or every day or something like that, and set it at night maybe as to when that refresh is going to occur. And so it is nice then to have this refresh failure notification on data flows, so when it does go through the refresh, if there's any issues, you can research it and figure out what's happening. We're going to leave it at manual at this point, and what we're going to do is we're actually going to go ahead and publish this, and what it's basically going to do is then generate and create that table. It's going to then set up that refresh that needs to occur with it, and once that publish is done, we should see now inside of our tables that vendor's V2 that we have that's going to be inside of here. So like you're saying, Caroline, shortcuts, right? So from an end user perspective, what we've just done is made it so that you can actually take a table, have it defined with it, and then have it actually go through and generate that as part of that particular process. So
Yeah, and just to clarify, I mean, this is a single direction data flow, right?
correct.
You're pulling vendor information out of finance and operations, you're not, performing an update against this data now is not going to update finance and operations.
Correct. It's a copy,
Yeah.
right, is part of it.
Yep.
And that
Yep.
gets
Just to
to that
clarify that.
that conversation, right, a little bit further as well with it. So once we have that set up, I'm going to let that run in the background. It's actually going to take a bit to actually go through that particular process. You can see it doesn't even show the data flow yet. So it takes a little bit of time during the initial setup with it. So now that we have the data that we would typically interact with, what can we do then beyond that to start creating interactivity with that data, right? And that's where we now move from Dataverse-based concepts, where we have our tables and our storage of that data, to our apps concepts, right? Where we're now building a Power App to interact with that particular data. So from a Power App perspective, I can come in here and I can generate, for example, a new Canvas-driven app. And I can say that this is my vendor rec app, as we would call it. Yep.
You want to just clarify the difference between a Canvas app and a model-driven app? I think people get confused by that.
That's a really good question. So a Canvas app, imagine that you have an application that is a blank canvas, meaning that you can take things and put them anywhere on that screen to interact then with that particular application. So you can take a text box, make it bigger or make it smaller, put it up to the top right corner or in the bottom left corner, wherever you want on the canvas. It's like you're painting something basically from a canvas perspective. That's what a Canvas app is. It allows you to really define the layout with it. And I'm going to Mark, it's a good point because we want to talk a little bit why that's different from an end user perspective, right?
Yep.
Because a model-driven app takes a lot of that control away from you. A model-driven app is more like Dynamics 365 Sales, where when you add, for example, controls or text boxes and all these different values to that application, it has a set format that it always renders it in. So you don't have total control to move a control and then put it somewhere else or to resize it to make changes to that. You can add new fields, but it's automated in terms of what that layout looks like then inside of the application. So that's
and there's pros and cons to both of them.
Correct.
I think. Yeah. And I think the model-driven app is much faster in terms of deployment across multiple tables, for example.
Yeah, well, let's do this.
By my thought.
Well, let's do this. Let's do customers. As I think that one's going to take a little bit longer to load in the background. So I'm going to do an application, and I'm going to do it the customer application. Now, one way would be to do exactly what I'm doing right here, which is that I'm starting from blank as we go through this process. But more typically, what you probably want to do as an end user is you want to go to this create section inside of here. And what you want to do is you want to create data that you start from with data, right? So that way you can get some examples of the different controls that are added into here, because it'll just frame it up for you on how to actually interact with it a little bit better. So an example of that, if I click on Dataverse inside of here, now that table that we just created as an example isn't going to be in here, but what I can do is I can actually reference a Dataverse connection, and it's really easy. If I didn't have this inside of here, I would do new connection, and then I would actually find Dataverse inside of here, and I would then click on it, and now all that data that we imported from any other system using that data flow is going to be accessible then for me to interact with a Power App perspective. And the reason that we're
bringing... plug there for Business Central connector.
Right, exactly. And this is the other, and that's a really important thing, Marcus, too. So a lot of people get confused right now. They're like, well, wait, why would I copy the data into vendors, into Dataverse, and not just reference it inside of Business Central? You can. Like, it's an option, and that's the beauty behind it. The best practice is typically that you're going to want to reference that read-only data inside of Business Central. But you have to remember that when your application is being used, it's consuming resources against Business Central. So if you're going to have 100 users that you're going to be developing this app for, you should contemplate whether or not it should be a copy of that data inside of Dataverse, because you're going to then hit the API limits potentially inside of Business Central. So these are conversations, like I said, that you typically have with it to be able to address that. But Dataverse is more common for that data to be stored. We can come in here, see all the tables, and look at all these different tables that we have that are inside of here, right? So I could search for vendors. I'm pretty sure I won't have it inside of here. Oh, there it is. There's the vendors. That's actually probably not the same one. But the point here is that you can actually go ahead then and then select that. And what it's going to do then, after you actually select that table as an example, is it's actually going to build that app for you with some basic app capability so you can understand what the basic flow of a Power App is for a Canvas-driven app. So
Yep.
what do I mean
And
by
if
that?
you're
Yep.
well, and if you're new to Power Apps, do this because you can just reverse engineer. You can
Oh,
see
huge.
exactly how they built this thing.
Huge, right? So
Yep.
in this
And you've
example,
got view, you've got edit, you've got update. You can see how to do those operations against the data set
and
right
this
here.
this is pretty dang easy once you understand it. So you can see here, I've got the vendors app. That's the data flow data that we have theoretically, right? That we're copying into here. If I look at this, really on my far left here, these are the screens that we have. We've got a browse screen, we have a detail screen, and we have an edit screen. And you guys can pretty much guess probably on stream then, right, which each of those are called. When I click on this, for example, you can see in my advanced here that it actually goes through and it selects the parent, and this is actually going to be then when I click on it, it's going to bring me then into the details page as part of this, right? So if I click on this, this goes back, right? Because that's an action that's inside of here. And one of the things that you're going to notice is that inside of a Power App, key areas to look at inside of here, when you highlight something, and I go to the far right here, typically you've got this, right, that is shown on the initial screen for you. Click on the advanced, and on the on select of a lot of these actions, this is where it tells you what it's going to do next when you click on it. So when I select this, for example, it's going to navigate to the browse screen 1, which is our screen up here, right? And then from there, it's going to then allow me to go back to really that particular content. So I can click on the browse screen and it will transition, or it won't have a transition as part of that. Now I could change this and say, you know what, I want this to have a fade transition. So these are like formulas inside of Excel, and that's the thing to note about this is when people say it's no code, it technically is no code. It's formula code, formula driven, right?
Yep.
So, you know, I don't know. I think that that's a little gray. I will call it, it's a little bit of code, right? You need to know the formulas. You need to know how the formula bar works. But the nice thing
Yes.
about it is that the formula bar up here does tell you all the different types of actions that you can interact with, and the documentation on this, like you had said, Marcus, it's great. That's out there, right?
Yep. There's actually I think when you went to create the app, we don't need to navigate back there. So you had the data options at the top.
Yep.
Down at the bottom there are actually a couple of I'm not gonna they're not templates, but there's actually like pilot projects that you can do. Microsoft has those set up. And they're worthwhile going through if you're new to this too, because you can actually go through the Canvas app development, and it'll give you a bunch of really the formulas that you need to know to build some basic stuff. It'll walk you through how to do it.
Yep. Yep, exactly. So
Yep.
I'm going to leave it at this. I mean, I would recommend to anyone that is on stream right now that is thinking about, I'd like to develop some applications that, you know, would be inside of systems, that this is a fantastic way to start. Like this base example with it to tackle a business requirement that you have is the easiest thing to start with. Because you can then, after you add, for example, you've got a browse, detail, and edit screen, you kind of get how that all works then. Well, you can create a new screen then, and you can add a list screen or a form, or have it success when it goes through a process, so to speak, right? So there's all these different types of template screens that you can interact with then to be able to then drive additional capabilities. And this is where it really differentiates from a Canvas app versus a model-driven app. An example would be if I do a blank screen that's inside of here, what I can do is I can go on my far right here and I can just drop a text label right there. Or I can add a gallery right here, for example, and then I can resize the gallery if I wanted to, right? So this is the difference with a Canvas app, is that you have total control over the canvas to be able to then drive some of those particular requirements that you may have. Because from an end user perspective, you can make a very pointed experience then for somebody to go through and do that. And just to kind of highlight that, I'm going to go to Powerapps real quick here. This is a perfect example of a Power App that you create that is now really focused on the end user experience, that's way different than what you would typically do with, for example, a model-driven app. So I'm going to go into my apps inside of here. I've got this ag app, I think I've shown before as well. This is a phone app that allows me to, for example, log in. So all of this was just formatted, right? So we started with some of the base screens. This is a bar that's on the bottom. This is another bar that's on the top. I'm going to go ahead and log in. You can see that it's actually going through and grabbing data. This is going to be a customer list as a search that's inside of here. I can type in, for example, Mr. Bangasser. We'll go ahead and add him to this particular shipment that we're going to be doing. You can see now that I've got icons that are inside of here. We've got bars that make it look very modern, right? We can see where we are inside of the process inside of here. I can see additional pertinent information that I may have. I've got buttons down here that I've resized, put icons on the buttons as well, and you can see it's a little clipped on the bottom there. But the point here, from a Canvas app, as you can see, it's really powerful. So you can come in here and search for corn, for example. I'm going to add corn on here. We're going to do 10 bushels. And we're going to use, I think it was a standard bulk bin is what I'll do with it. Add that away. Here we've got our container of items that are on here. I can click on next to this. So all of this layout is something that I was able to do inside of a Canvas app then to be able to basically go through and do a shipment. And that's kind of what we ended up with as part of this design, right? Now, if we go to a model-driven app, let's just show that really quickly, because that is going to be different, right? So model-driven apps, if we start with Dataverse as an example inside of here as well, excuse me, wrong one. If I do a model-driven app, a model-driven app actually looks at really tables. So if I do vendors as an example, vendors confab, we'll do testing model app as an example. Click on create. Here's the way I always differentiate this. A Canvas app, great for end users that need very quick, high impact. Let's enter in a transaction. Let's make it very fluid for them. Perfect. Like Canvas apps are absolutely perfect for that. Model-driven apps, they're really good for more advanced users. So I need to, for example, have requisitions and I need to have an approval process that's related to it. Well, maybe you should think about using a model-driven app to do that, because it actually provides then a lot more structure from an interface perspective on how you actually go through and then do that. So an example here, I can add a page. Yep, Marcus, go ahead.
And the term model here is really going to drive some of the app development based on, let's say, table relationships, right? Things that you've predefined around your data as well, correct?
Mm-hmm. That is correct.
Yeah.
Yep. So, and that's a very important topic to bring up. So you can see here, like this looks like Dynamics 365 sales almost immediately. Like if I go into the sales application, which we'll do really quickly here in the background, you're going to see then that a model-driven app really looks like that. So an example, we go to our apps that are inside of here. I have, if we go into the right environment once again, we'll go to our apps, and then we look for Sales Hub, which is an app that's inside of here. So there it is. That's a model-driven app. If I click on that, and then we let that load in the background really quickly here, we're going to see that basically this app that we have inside of here is really the same thing that I'm designing over here, right? So yep. Our menu is over here. Our grouping information is here as well. We can add additional content to have more menu items that are going to be inside of here. We can change the column layout, right?
Yeah. A couple of things here to note. Like you've got built-in quick find. You've got built-in alphabetical searches across the bottom. You've got a built-in filter. You've got the ability to create views here, right? I mean, there's a lot of things that you just automatically inherent as part of the app that you don't have to build out.
Correct.
The
It's
Canvas
almost
app,
plumbing,
you're gonna have
right?
to build those things. Yeah.
Exactly. So a lot of the
Yep.
plumbing is taken care of on a model-driven app for you. I almost
Yep.
equate it to back in the day Silverlight. I don't know if everyone in chat if you ever used that, but
Fortunately.
yeah, right. So Silverlight was one that I used. Light Switch was another one too. I think Light Switch was the one that built on Silverlight that allowed you basically to do very quick applications that you could actually design then very similar to this. And we used that at a couple different sites before. It was kind of the iteration one, I would say, of a simplified development or rapid application development environment.
Yep.
So
But you're gonna get a menu system here that you can enhance, but you're gonna get some of those core functionality pieces that you're not gonna have to build out.
yeah, and I can add, for example, a dashboard into it. And I can
Yep.
say, for example, I want to add the overview dashboard that's inside of here, right? And so this one doesn't have any components, obviously, but it's basically taking care of a lot of that model-driven perspective that you can then interact with. You can export to Excel as an example, and you can actually have it where it's open in Excel, so that way you can actually edit data then inside of here to be able to do that. And I haven't written a single line of code then to get to that.
Yeah, and that's exactly the point, Scott. This is about you just see fairly quick deployment option using a Power App.
Yep, exactly.
I don't have to build all of these extra components around it.
So the next step here then from an app perspective, so now you know the difference, where the data is stored, how you can get it in there very quickly, right? So just import it, or if you have connectors set up for it, you can go directly for it. And if you're really lucky, you've got dual write or you've got the native integration already enabled between Dataverse, you've figured out what kind of apps there are, right? So I could either develop, for example, a Canvas-driven app that would be very pointed for me to interact with. That's either a tablet or a phone layout. And typically, if you're curious on it, if you're worried about which one you should start with first, start with the tablet app. The tablet app gives you more screen real estate. It looks better on desktops as well. And you can actually scale the tablet app. There's a setting that allows it to shrink to the phone application size for it. So that's another quick tip for you. Consider doing it in that fashion. There's lots of documentation out there to be able to do that. The model,
yeah, actually, and I don't know if people caught that. If you're gonna run a Power App in a browser, go with the tablet format.
Exactly.
I 100% agree, because the phone is just limited screen real estate. If you're in a browser anyway, don't go that route.
Exactly. So now when we go from development, now we've gotten to the point where we've developed the app, we actually have the data that we have. Now we need to actually maybe embed this somewhere or interact with it somewhere, right? One would be that you actually take the application and you publish it, so it's a published application like this, and then you can use your phone and download Powerapps, as the light turns on, Powerapps, and install it, and then interact with it on your phone, right? So immediately it does that. But there are other options too that you have, and this is the challenging the development paradigm. You can take these apps and embed them into our applications. An example of that, let's go to finance and operations. In finance and operations, I've got sales orders and processing that I need to do inside of here. And on my sales orders, I had an example, and I've shared this on Confab before, but I have an example where I can basically specify, if I click on here and we'll go to Bull for Pure Enterprises, that was from one of our demos that we did with Mr. David Bull. Go to our header right here. On our header, we don't have any map control in here. So when I click on address, I can't see any detail about that particular address, right? So, and if I do a drill down in here to look at different address information, I can select it, change it. I've got long and lat that are involved with it, so on and so forth. Well, what you can do inside of finance and operations is that you can actually add an app inside of here. And when you click on add that app, you can actually then reference the application that you typically interact with so that it's actually exposed inside of the interface. And what's even cooler about this is that you can actually pass, for example, the order number to the application, so that way it can use that API call that we were looking at to grab more information about that order, like the address, the customer name, all of those details inside of finance and operations apps. And what we do with that then is an example like this. So we've got, we'll allow it real quick here. This is a Power App that's inside of finance and operations. So this app right here is a map app that's actually going back into that order to grab that information to figure out specifically what the address information is here. And you'll see it load in the background. This is the first time I've opened it in a while. But it's really cool about it is that you can actually develop this app and then you can use it in many different applications then, right? So this is a Canvas app that allows me then to use some of those basic controls, satellite. I can do, overlays and drawing on it and all that kind of stuff. But I can go further than that. I can go, for example, into my phone and then open this up and interact with it. Or I could go into BC, for example, and inside of BC, I could actually have a Power BI report that then references that application as well that I can interact with, right? So here's an example then of a Power App that's loading up in the background here. I'll allow it here as well. But inside of BC...
That actually is how we get Power Apps into Business Central.
Yeah, right?
So in Business Central, we don't yet have that ability to reference the Power App directly. So this is more of an indirect reference to it.
Exactly, right?
Yep.
But the point is that we're able to at least then have, and this was one that we did that was an aging that was then shown inside of here. This is a Canvas-driven app that's now inside of BC that I can interact with, right? So, I mean, as you can see here, when we go through this process and really start demystifying it a little bit more, it's not that hard to do. It's not that hard to get the data and interact with it, and to have all these tools then that quick start you to be able to really then interact with that data, modify it, change it, do whatever you want with it. So I don't know.
But again, it's a paradigm shift. It absolutely is to know how these tools can work, what they could do, and then add those to the development conversation.
Exactly, right? I'd be curious in chat too what you guys think of this type of content as well, because this is we've gone through a lot of the different areas in some detail here as we go through it, right? And longer term as well, obviously Power Platform and Dataverse are going to come. They're going to be even a bigger part of the conversation. Like, we're going to start seeing where more than likely you've got, Dataverse and finance and operations apps not linked through DualWrite, but through some other type of technology, right? So, and in BC, the same thing. Like, when we insert something, for example, we want it to go to both systems, and we want to represent it as one system in the future here. So, it's pretty interesting to see what's going on there. So, Dave, it looks like, what would you say that nearly all Canvas apps also have a model-driven app, but not every model-driven app will have a Canvas app? I would say that that's probably more true than not. A lot of Canvas apps, and actually I kind of take that back. I guess a lot of people don't know the right tool for it, Dave, is the way I come to with it. So if it's somebody that's new to the platform, typically what they're going to do is they're probably going to start with a Canvas-driven app, because a Canvas-driven app is something that is more commonly, it was one of the first app types basically that was introduced with it. And it's easier to understand because you can drag and drop things. It's a what you see is what you get type of environment. And
especially if you're a developer, you're going to probably be drawn to that environment first.
Yep. So the problem is that most people don't understand then what you use a model-driven app for. And so typically as you get more mature with the Power Platform, you start with that Canvas-driven app. You then find out that it really isn't good for like approvals or for management of data, so to speak, because it's really pointed for the ingestion of data. And then you build a model-driven app then, for example, to do approvals. Or an example would be for timesheets. An end user wants timesheets on a Canvas-driven app because they can quickly enter their time, hopefully, and click on OK to it. But a manager is going to want more than likely a model-driven app because they want to see a list of different users that they're interacting with. And recreating that in a Canvas-driven app versus just using a model-driven app, it's a lot more effort on the Canvas-driven app to be able to do that. So, a really good question.
I would agree.
And then you've got the other requirement too, sometimes where they'll start with a model-driven app because they just want an active vendor list that they can interact with. And you can see here when I click on this, all these forms that are actually in the background that were part of that table are already exposed here. They just want something very quick and easy for lookup where they don't have to worry about the visualization with it. And they're using a desktop application, more commonly like a browser, to be able to interact with it. So there's pros and cons to each, and I think the fun thing here is to challenge it and try it first, right? Go through, build it, and see what happens, and I think that you'd be really happy at the end either way with either technology that you drive off of it.
Yep.
Cool. So Marcus, I know we're
You're at
getting
the
to
top of the
time,
hour.
right?
There you go.
So I
Yeah.
know that went fast. I want to do so much more too. I mean, there's just, we could do, the next step with this would have been, for example, taking data and bringing it back, for example, into there using the APIs. Same pattern that we used before, but now you just use Power Automate to now, like for example, let's say it was requisitions, you would create a table inside a Dataverse. People would select the vendor, do a requisition for that vendor, for example, save that requisition. Well, use Power Automate then when you click on the Submit button to go copy that into Business Central as a purchase order now. You've just made an app at that point to do requisitions when there's no native requisition capability, for example, in BC. So it's just like super simple in that regard to be able to do that.
Yep.
Marcus, any other words of wisdom that you can think of before we kind of wrap up here?
No, I have nothing else to add today.
Right, it's a lot that we went through with it. So I guess, guys, just to kind of give you an update on where we are with everything else, it looks like our next session on December 2nd, we're going to have an open Q&A session. So please bring your questions. We'll obviously have tons of stuff to talk about. We'll probably bring out some of the Inspire stuff as well that they went through from a data perspective and all the changes that are occurring, the licensing perspective and some of those changes that are occurring as well. Really, we want to just make sure that we answer any questions that you have. So please feel free to call your friends up, tell them to join. It's a great way to play Stump the Chump with us. We absolutely love to go through these conversations. But yeah, that'll be on our next session on December 2nd at this point. And then I think, Marcus, right after that, we're going to have a call today to talk about our next steps for Confab. But, we're trying to contemplate. We made this the year of data, and data is everywhere now. We're trying to think what's the year of 2022 yet. So we don't have it yet, but we're going to soon, right? So
Yep.
Should be fun. Anyways, all right, guys, appreciate you for
Have a
joining.
good Thanksgiving to everybody.
Yep.
Yeah.
Stay
Hopefully
warm.
It's restful and maybe get to see some people you haven't seen.
I hope so, right? I hope so.
Yep.
All right, guys, have a good one. We will see you later.